a major data breach, a super injunction, a secret route that has already cost hundreds of millions of pounds.
The Prime Minister sums up one of the biggest political stories for ages. We will speak to the journalist who broke it and who the state tried to silence on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And it is Chris at Westminster.
And we're going to have another quick catch-up with Washington, D.C. in the second half of this episode. But the first half is dominated by an absolutely huge story that broke in Westminster on Tuesday morning. Even though the story itself had been going for years. This is the story of the data breach at the Ministry of Defence that meant that lots of sensitive data about people who'd worked with the British military in Afghanistan was sent out to people who it shouldn't have been sent out to. And then as a result, the government got a super injunction, which meant that no journalists could report the story. And we'll speak to one of the journalists who was on the story from the very beginning in a minute. But Chris, first of all, just give me your take on the sort of the massive nature of this and the very secretive nature of this story.
I think it's really significant, this. There's lots of stuff that happens at Westminster that we kind of attach superlatives to and, people get excited about or whatever. But this is a real kind of core blimey story because it kind of has everything, really, in that you've got an initial moment of extraordinary human fallibility, this sending of an email inadvertently with thousands and thousands of crucial and very sensitive bits of data and information in it about people who were fearful of the Taliban, and it's sent to Afghanistan, and it becomes apparent that it's out of control. It's in hands that it shouldn't be in. Then you have, and of course we've only found out all of this in the last 24, 36 hours. Then you have the government at the time, the Conservatives a few years ago, thinking, what on earth do we do here? Lives are at risk, and so they apply for a injunction. That then becomes what's known as a super injunction, where even reporting its existence you can't do. And now we have the newish government, albeit a year into their time in office, saying that they can lift this injunction and they can wrap up the scheme that was giving people a chance to get out because of the fear that this leak would imperil their safety. So you've got questions asked about the Conservatives. I've spoken to a good number of senior Conservatives who were in the thick of it at the time, and they say, weren't wildly comfortable with the idea of a injunction, but they say this was simply necessary because the alternative was the risk that lots of people could be killed, to be blunt. And their view is any minister presented with that scenario would have acted broadly in the way that they did. Then there are questions about why it went on for so long. Labour are making the argument, look, it's them who unravelled this, not the Conservatives. But others are saying, yeah, but did it need to take this long? So John Healey, when he was the Shadow Defence Secretary, was briefed about this in opposition. The Prime Minister was only briefed at the point that he became Prime Minister. They set up a review that began in January looking into all of this. Now, their argument is, look, this is quite complicated and you've got to give it proper attention before you start unravelling it. There are one or two who say, well, did it really need to take a year? Perhaps most of it, or indeed all of the risk was resolved, in relatively short order. And so you've got this argument that then rages about, is this an example of state failure? What is a legitimate use of these super injunctions? And you have Labour and the Conservatives now, frankly, in classic political terms, sort of, making arguments against one another. And you got Reform saying that this is a kind of a case study in state failure and a case study in the failure of the two big parties at Westminster.
And there's lots of discussion, particularly online, about the financial cost of this.
Yeah. And it's worth unpicking a few of these numbers because some of the numbers running into the billions are clearly huge, but the argument that is made is that those really, really big numbers were about the overall projected costs of the schemes to help Afghans leave Afghanistan and come to the UK, including the schemes that we've known about all along, as opposed to the additional costs associated with this cock-up, basically, and then what had to be done to try and mitigate the potential impact of that data leak. So the emergency resettlement scheme for those affected by the breach, it was called the Afghanistan response route, has seen 4,500 Afghans arrive in the UK. It's cost £400 million with a projected final cost of £850 million. And they reckon, the Ministry of Defence, that just shy of 7,000 people are expected to come in the end. But the scheme is now closed. And, that's another factor. There's two other factors there, aren't there, that come out of those numbers. One is we're forever talking on Newscast about the challenges that the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, faces. There comes an additional challenge, because that's money that, wouldn't have been needed to be spent without this mistake. And then the other is the implications in terms of the housing, the settlement, the processing of people who might not otherwise have needed or even wanted to leave their home country without this mistake, and then the actions taken in response to it. So the implications of this, the consequences of this, continue just as the scrutiny of it just really gets going, because there'll be a parliamentary inquiry into this. There'll be lots of questions, and there's loads of folk, no doubt, that will have to account for themselves publicly about the decisions that they took.
Yeah, and hearing about the data breach and the idea of emails with spreadsheets attached being forwarded to the wrong person just reminds me of the evacuation from Kabul originally, and you would speak to MPs at the time who were being emailed by constituents with desperate stories about their family members, and then those MPs would be forwarding those on to the Ministry of Defence and the defence ministers to their parliamentary email address, and then MPs would be getting emailed by the same person multiple different times, and it was all there was just information flowing in at such great speed, and it did take the government a little while to design a system to just capture all of that, let alone deal with the actual people on the ground in Afghanistan who were affected by it.
Yeah, all of that. And again, speaking to people today who were in the thick of all of that, they would use, and I know it's a cliche, but it's the kind of the sense of the fog of war at the time, that this was incredibly fraught. Lots of people attempt, believing that they're acting in good faith, whether it's backbench MPs or whoever it might be, but where you had data sets that the government was compiling that were in many senses partial, but then would also include colossal overlaps, the same names popping up repeatedly because they'd been put in by various actors in the wider conversation. So yeah, I mean, and that then opens up, doesn't it, all sorts of questions about what procedures the MOD was using, how on earth you end up with a situation where this leak was possible. But then also, because it's very easy to forget this, and it's important, I think, as you were saying there, to just wind our memory back a bit, that was a extraordinarily tumultuous moment where very little was predictable or certain, where data sets were very messy, where there was huge anger and frustration, and that's the context. It's not necessarily an excuse, of course, but that's the context in which this happened.
Right. Let's speak to one of the journalists who was first on the case and who was one of the people who was super injuncted. Although I suppose we actually were all super injuncted because no one would be allowed to talk about it. It's Larisa Brown, who is defence editor at The Times. Hello, Larisa.
Hello.
And congratulations on your mega scoop.
Thank you very much.
So I'm sure you've been asked this a lot in the last 24 hours, but just take me back to the moment you realised you were onto something.
Well, this was 2 years ago, which seems an extraordinary length of time. I was on maternity leave, actually. It was August 2023. And I was about to publish a book about the Afghans called The Garden of Lashkar. And I had lots of Afghans often coming to my home. And I found out that there'd been this data breach that affected the lives of thousands of Afghans who had been put at risk. And then a few days later, it emerged that there was a super injunction preventing us from actually revealing that information, and also preventing us revealing the fact that a court order even existed. And then when I returned from maternity leave, I called the Ministry of Defence and told them I knew exactly what had happened, and I knew that there was a super injunction. And they hauled me into the Ministry of Defence. I was told that I needed to bring a lawyer. Obviously, that had never happened before. And we went inside a room at the MOD in Whitehall where we were faced with a team of MOD lawyers. And at that point in that meeting, we were served with the injunction. And that meant that when we left that room, we weren't able to talk about that super injunction or the case to anyone. And if we did, we could face prison. So it was pretty daunting stuff. And it was extremely, after that, we weren't able to tell, even senior members at the Times, if we wanted to tell anybody, then we had to provide that name to the court for them to put in a document.
And also, you actually were in court a couple of times making your side of the argument.
Yes, well, so in January 2024, we became defendants, and the Times then spearheaded the legal fight to get the super injunction lifted. And just before we became defendants, I did stand up in court. The judge did allow myself and others to address him, which was unusual in itself. And we were pointing out that there was a general election coming up, that this was an election issue because of the severity of the incident, and there were major policy decisions being made without Parliament scrutiny and without the public knowing. And also, we later went on to argue that the Afghans also weren't aware that their data had been breached, which meant that they weren't able to take any safety measures. As a result, they weren't able to decide whether they needed to change their emails or their phone numbers, because the Taliban could suddenly end up with their personal information.
And you said you know lots of people, Afghans in the UK, Afghans in Afghanistan. Have you been in touch with anyone who's been affected in the last 24 hours or so? How are they feeling about it?
I have, and I'm just trying to put together a piece now. And one of them's a really sad case for me, because he has been trying to come to the UK for a long time. He's the brother of a dead interpreter who had died whilst on an operation with British forces. And this individual that I know, he actually was trying to escape the country in 2021 when we saw those awful scenes of people trying to flee as the British troops left Afghanistan. And he's applied to come to Britain, and he is on the list, and he is terrified because he doesn't know what to do. He can't afford to move house. He doesn't know what information he needs to change. He's telling us that he sent the MOD his photograph. So he's wondering, could the Taliban end up with his photo? And he's really alarmed and worried by the situation.
And Larisa, what about the government's argument that the risk to the people in Afghanistan who are named on the list has decreased, that actually that's why it's a sort of safer environment for the super injunction to be lifted?
It's a confusing picture from the government, because at the same time, they're also arguing that there is still a risk to those Afghans. And so they're not saying that there isn't a risk that the Taliban, tries to kill them. So that, these people are still worried for their safety. And I think there's also more confusion because they don't know exactly what was on the list. The government hasn't told them. They've just obviously sent generic emails to everybody saying to be careful. Now, that's not very much information. They don't know if the Taliban's got their home address. They don't know if the Taliban's got their passports. They don't know, they don't know this crucial detail.
And yesterday there was talk of kind of future legal action from people who were on the list in various forms. What have you learned about that?
There's one law firm, Bearings Law, that has around 1,000 Afghans already signed up to sue the MOD. I think that number is probably going to rise substantially over the coming days. There's also likely to be reviews of there's judicial reviews ongoing into Afghan cases. They're likely to be affected by all of this. So I think this is really going to rumble on for quite some time.
Now, the former Conservative Defence Secretary Ben Wallace was on the Today programme this morning. Let's play a little bit of what he said.
I took a decision that the most important priority was to protect those people who could have been or were exposed by this data leak in Afghanistan, living amongst the Taliban, who had no regard for their safety or indeed potentially could torture them or murder them. That was my priority. Now, I felt, and people can criticize me all they like on that, and they have a right to that opinion, that if we weren't given time and space to deal with this leak, find out whether the Taliban had it, and to date, there's no actual evidence they have now got it, and John Healey quite rightly has done a review subsequently, and to then start the process of getting out of that country those people who would have been put at risk by that data. And that was my pride. I'm glad I'm not on this radio program today saying, I'm terribly sorry all these people were killed or captured by the Taliban.
So, Larisa, how convinced are you by what he said on the Today programme?
Ben Wallace, at the beginning, he wanted an injunction for 4 months, and the judge upgraded it to a super injunction. I don't doubt that he had the best, the interests of the Afghans in his mind. I don't doubt that. But the super injunction lasted for a very long time, and the fact that this government review in the last few months has found, as you said, that the threat had diminished. I mean, there's just a lot of questions about whether the super injunction should have remained in place for that amount of time and whether this could have been handled a lot better.
And just going back to where we started and the data breach initially, what more can you tell us about what the data breach actually was? Because we know it was a soldier sort of working as an administrator, and it involved a spreadsheet being sent to the wrong person. Do we know anything more than that?
We know that the individual was a soldier. He was also an official. He was working at Special Forces headquarters in Regent's Park. He was working under the command of General Sir Gwyn Jenkins, who's now the head of the Navy. He was trying to verify applications to come to the UK. He sent an email to Afghans in the UK with what he thought was about 150 names. What he didn't realise is that actually he was sending a database of 33,000 applications. The Afghans who he sent it to then sent it on to people in Afghanistan. And then what happened 18 months later, so in August 2023, one Afghan who ended up with that list then threatened to post it threatened to publish it in a Facebook post. And that is when the government found out about this extraordinary mistake by this soldier.
Which is another kind of head-scratching aspect of this whole head-scratching story, the gap between the data breach and the government realising they'd breached the data.
I know it seems amazing that it could take that long for them actually to realise. And when they first saw this post on Facebook, obviously they didn't know why this person had ended up with this list, and that sparked a huge operation inside the MOD and wider government involving the security agencies to work out whether had a foreign state hacked into the government systems. They didn't actually know what had happened.
And Larisa, we're recording this bit of Newscast at 4:45, which I know is kind of danger time for print journalists because the deadline is approaching. So I'm going to let you get back to your writing. But thank you very much for talking to us today and for your amazing piece of journalism.
Thank you very much.
So that's Larisa's take on today. Actually, let's hear Keir Starmer's take on it when he was speaking at the final Prime Minister's questions before the summer holiday.
We warned in opposition about Conservative management of this policy. And yesterday, the Defence Secretary set out the full extent of the failings that we inherited. A major data breach, a super injunction, a secret route that has already cost hundreds of millions of pounds. Ministers who served under the party opposite have serious questions to answer about how this was ever allowed to happen. The chair of the Defence Committee has indicated that he intends to hold further inquiries. I welcome that and hope that those who were in office at the time will welcome that scrutiny.
So, Chris, I imagine there's going to be a long tail to this, isn't there, with other legal action, parliamentary inquiries, MPs getting upset about not being told. There's lots of angles to be pursued on this. Yeah,
there really is. And if we just take a couple of steps back, we're a quarter of a century on from the beginnings of the Afghan conflict that the UK was a part of in the time after 9/11 in 2001. There were all of those British casualties during the war itself. And what we're seeing here is an ongoing implication of that conflict so many years on, where there are still those live questions about the risk that some people might face as a result of this. And the government's of the view that they think that risk is now minimal, mitigated, and dissolved, if you like. And then, all of those questions that will be asked about procedures in the Ministry of Defence, about political accountability, about the legitimacy or otherwise of these injunctions. And then, of course, and this is where it comes back to this sort of allegation of state failure, if you like, in an era of deep cynicism about politics, which is that whenever there is a story about a super injunction, we've not had one for a while, but whenever there is one, the obvious question to which the answer is we don't know is what other ones are there, and that's instantly a question that can sort of seed cynicism in those in power and authority.
On a completely different note, just explain why, as we record this episode of Newscast at 6:42 on Wednesday evening, there were 4 fewer Labour MPs than there were at, say, 2:42 this afternoon.
Yeah, so the Prime Minister has suspended 4 Labour MPs from the Labour Parliamentary Party, taken the whip from them, to use the Westminster jargon. So Neil Duncan-Jordan, Brian Leishman, Chris Hinchliffe and Rachel Maskell, they were characters in the whole business of the benefits rows of a couple of weeks ago. 3 other Labour MPs have been stripped of trade envoy roles, so sort of roles where they're working on behalf of the government. Rosanna Alin Khan, Belrabiro Adi and Mohammed Yassin. And so what we're seeing is almost a kind of history repeating itself moment, because last summer the Prime Minister took the whip off a handful of Labour MPs who had rebelled on the whole business of the 2-child benefit cap. And a handful of months later, the whip for a fair few of them was restored. Here you have these 4 losing the whip. Let's see if any others might do too. It's a curious strategy, because they're not the only ones who rebelled, but they're relatively prominent, a few of them, in terms of the noises that they were making. And the question then is, does it work? Because the Prime Minister did it last year in order to send a message to the rest of the parliamentary party, which is, this is what happens if you get noisy. In the year that's gone on since, a far more number than a quartet have been noisy. So where is it reasonable to draw the line? What is regarded as justified, or in the eyes of some petty? But yes, notionally, the Prime Minister's majority shrinks a little more, and then they'll have to work out, what might count as the good behaviour necessary for them to have the whip restored, assuming in time that that's what they would like to see happen.
And Keir Starmer is either strong or weak, depending on your point of view.
Basically, yes, and that is, to an extent with his political actions, that's always a prism through which these things are looked at. But when you've done as they have here and picked 4. Where there's, of course, an element of discretion in who gets picked and who doesn't, then that question is unquestionably sort of live in all of this.
An unquestionably live question.
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
Like Donald Trump's positive non-thinking. Right, Chris, good to see you.
Ta-ra.
Donald Trump's first U-turn this week was deciding to supply arms to Ukraine via European allies who will actually be buying them from America. And now we're witnessing his second one. And it's to do with the so-called Epstein files. And the subject of those files and what's in them and the so-called Epstein list was a big thing for Donald Trump's fan base, the Make America Great Again crowd. It was a big thing at one point for Donald Trump too. But now that he's actually in office and lots of his supporters have big jobs in the government, they're not really publishing anything that to his supporters looks like the Epstein list. So what's going on? And is this a bit of a rupture between Donald Trump and his superfans? The person who can answer those questions, as always, is BBC News chief reporter in Washington, D.C. and great friend of Newscast, Katrina Perry, who's here. Hello, Katrina.
Hi, Adam. Good to be with you.
Welcome back. So when supporters of Donald Trump say about or talk about something they call the Epstein list or the Epstein files or Epstein's clients, what do they think they're talking about?
Kind of 2 parts to that. So the Epstein files are broadly the name given to all the documents relating to the case of Jeffrey Epstein, who pleaded guilty in 2008 to sexual misconduct charges, and he died by suicide in August 2019 while in prison awaiting trial on federal sex trafficking charges. So we're talking about the Epstein files. It's relating to that, and it's relating to a conspiracy theory around how he died, whether he did in fact die by suicide or whether he was murdered in his cell, and who his friends were and who may have been involved in this alleged sex trafficking that he was accused of. Now, the client list is, let's say, part of the Epstein files, and that is something that really has been given massive significance by some of the most high-profile MAGA supporters and indeed the president himself on the campaign trail last year. Now, Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, when she came into office earlier this year, she referred to this client list and said it was on her desk and she was about to go through it. Fast forward to the last couple of days and she said, oh, there isn't actually a client list. There's just a whole bundle of documents, court documents relating to the case.
And what reaction has that provoked from the MAGA supporters?
There has been an explosion or implosion, whatever way you want to look at it, of really distrust and shock and disappointment and all of those words, because this was one of the sort of signature platforms of Donald Trump on the campaign trail and the MAGA movement, that they viewed this massive conspiracy theory that the people on this so-called client list were really high-profile elites, mostly in the Democratic world, that there was a massive cover-up, that the government under President Joe Biden, the Democratic Party, were protecting really powerful individuals in this country. And the president and all of his supporters swore as soon as they got into office, they would publish all of this, they would be transparent, they would shine a light on it, they would reveal all of these people. And some of the most high-profile people speaking out about this, the president himself and Pam Bondi, but also two people who are now in charge of the FBI director, Kash Patel, and his deputy, Dan Bongino. Dan Bongino in particular had a big following on a podcast, and this was something he really railed about and pledged to uncover when they got into the administration. Now that they're in the administration, they are saying there's nothing to see here. This is a nothing burger.
I mean, is this the first rift between Donald Trump and his fans?
It's the first major one, and it's over something that's really questioning the trust that many of these supporters had for President Trump. They're now questioning, have one of three things happened, really. Has President Trump and his supporters who are in the administration, like I mentioned, the Attorney General and the team in the FBI, have they found out that actually this big conspiracy theory, this big cover-up that they were alleging, that actually there was no cover-up after all, but that they believed there was one, but they've now found out there wasn't one? That's option one. Option two is, are they in fact involved somehow in this, and are they now trying to cover up for themselves? This is how some in the MAGA world would see it. And have they now become part of the problem themselves? Or the third option is they never thought there was a cover up there at all, and it was just something kind of convenient to rile the base up about, to rile that anti-Democrat, anti-Joe Biden feeling. So there's kind of three options. None of them are good at all for the president and his supporters. And I mean, when you're listening to the podcasts in the MAGA world, some of Donald Trump's closest supporters on Capitol Hill really questioning, what is he doing here, and why won't he make all of these files public if indeed they do exist? And of course, he and the Attorney General are saying they don't exist.
And Katrina, I'll ask you how Donald Trump is handling this and the different versions of how he's handled it over the last few weeks. But let's listen to how he handled it when he was in the Oval Office and asked about this earlier on Wednesday when he had the Crown Prince of Bahrain sat next to him.
Will you ask Attorney General Pam Bondi to release more documents to finally put this controversy to bed?
Whatever's credible, she can release. If a document is credible, if a document's there that is credible, she can release. I think it's good. But it's just really, it's just a subject. He's dead. He's gone, and all it is the Republicans. Certain Republicans got duped by the Democrats, and they're following a Democrat playbook. And no different than Russia, and all the other hoaxes. They're started by the Democrats, and some Republicans, in this case I was surprised, but they got duped.
Yeah, so that's how Donald Trump was telling the Crown Prince of Bahrain about what's going on. Katrina, what's your take on how Donald Trump himself has handled this?
I mean, it's kind of dangerous when you hear the language that he used there in the Oval Office, calling his own supporters stupid people, saying they've been duped by Democrats, when just a few months ago he was basically in the trenches with them on this issue. That's a dangerous road to go down in many ways. However, Donald Trump himself won't be on the ballot again for president unless something seriously dramatically has changed with the law in this country. So in a way, he doesn't really have to care about that, and he does want to move on. I mean, we heard that many times in the Oval Office today. Let's just move on, and earlier in the week as well. Why are we talking about this guy who's been dead? You know, he's calling him a creep. This is a guy he did actually used to hang out with. There are photographs and videos of him partying with Jeffrey Epstein back in the day, but he's now calling him a creep and saying, let's just move on. I want to talk about the great work I'm doing on the economy, because it's really inconvenient for him, to put it mildly, to have so many of his core base supporters really agitating, not just against him, but against some in his team as well.
I think the word that jumped out for me in his post on Truth Social about this, which was quite a long post, was he talks about his former supporters believing this, what he describes as a hoax. So he's almost like he's leaving behind some people.
Exactly, and he called them weaklings as well. And as we know, for President Trump, the absolute worst thing you can be is weak. He loves people that are strong, sentiments that are strong. And it's dangerous to say to these people who built him up, built his movement up, got him elected, I don't need you anymore. You're stupid, you're weak, you're trusting the wrong people. This is a hoax that's been made up by the Democrats, which again, every time he says that, you'll see the chatter on the online forums moving into the category of, well, is the president involved here? And is he now trying to cover up for himself? And they're saying, if you have nothing to hide, put it all out there. But, you know, we heard from Pam Bondi earlier in the week that all these videos that they've always talked about existing, thousands of hours of videos, she's saying, well, actually, those aren't videos of Jeffrey Epstein and his, so-called famous friends and whatever, that they're actually videos of child sex abuse, and we're not going to be making those public. And she said she has put everything into the public domain that is relevant. President says he trusts her on that, and anyone who doesn't now trust him has been duped and is stupid, and he doesn't need them anymore.
I'm also just thinking of another position that Donald Trump has moved away from, which is on Ukraine. Like, he now seems quite enthusiastic for him, about supplying Ukraine with weapons via NATO allies in Europe. And he also sounds much less enthusiastic about Vladimir Putin. I just wonder how that's playing with the MAGA base as well.
Honestly, this issue of the Epstein files for those MAGA supporters is generating far greater chatter than his switcheroo, if you like, from Russia to Ukraine. And the key part about his change in support now for Ukraine is that he is not giving any more American money to Ukraine. And that was really the key pledge. He wasn't really saying, we'll no longer help people who need help. He says we're no longer using American money around the world to fight other countries' wars. And here he's been very clear every time he talks about it to say, well, I've got the Europeans to pay for all of this. This isn't American money. And in actual fact, they're going to be buying our weapons. So we'll even get money for our support of Ukraine. So isn't this fabulous? And kind of how clever am I to have come up with this and got the Europeans to agree?
So interesting. Katrina, great to catch up as always.
Never a dull moment, is there?